Good. Hi, Dena.
G.
So I'm here with Dena Harry Saleh, and we're going to be talking about sensitivity reading. Tell me a little bit about yourself and how or why you became a sensitivity reader.
Yeah, so I am a non-binary queer child of Palestinian immigrants. I was raised Muslim. I'm neurodivergent, and let's see, what other marginalized identity do I have? Yeah, and so even just coming from that, positionality, I feel like I um, can, well, first of all, definitely read for those biases in any kind of creative work, specifically for my identities. But also, as we've spoken about before, I was a school teacher for 11 years for fourth to eighth graders, and I taught a class called Social Justice Studies. And so in that class, we learned all about U.S. history, the founding of this country, and how violent and racist it was, how sexist it was, anti-Black and all of that. And so, learning the history of this country, I've gotten a really good sense of the structural oppression that's been woven into the fabric of this country, which is structural. And then it kind of comes down into, it can even, leak into interpersonal relationships and even within ourselves. There are folks who have internalized this racism or sexism or queer phobia or whatever, and kind of turned that on themselves and hate themselves for it. So either speak badly about, their own community, or never are comfortable with being who they are. So, in teaching children, got a really good sense of structural oppression and bias. And as I left teaching, I've always loved writing. I went to college for writing. So, found that sensitivity reading was a job. And so I started doing it. And yeah, so I can read for, like I mentioned, my identities, which it's always good if you have a specific identity to find someone of that identity, so that they can, and of course, no one can speak for everyone, right? But as we understand the nature of oppression, and can even locate it within ourselves and be honest about that, it's much, much easier to do it for all the oppressions and be open to it too, And so, so that's what led me to sensitivity reading. And yeah, I just think that media in general could do much better at portraying different marginalized groups. And hopefully, I can be part of that.
Right, right. Well, I know this is a very basic question you kind of touched upon already, but just tell me what sensitivity reading is exactly, and how did this need come about? Because it's pretty new.
Yeah, it is new. It's within the past even 20 years, I would say, and it's still kind of coming about, and it's not very well known, I would say. So sensitivity reading is, and I don't love the name of it. Like, I like to think of it as humanity reading.
I
But
love that.
yeah.
Tell me first why you don't like the word sensitivity reading, or not that it's not.
Yeah, and it's not even that. I don't think it captures exactly what it is, and so I think also it kind of plays into this idea that dominant culture has of marginalized people being too sensitive. And so that kind
A
of,
victim mentality.
exactly. And
Oh, you're
so
so sensitive. You're being a victim.
exactly. And that's why I like humanity reading, because we're all human and we're very multifaceted, complicated people. But, that's the term that is, the most widely used term right now. So I'll use that for myself. And it's just a person who can read for bias. And so if you are writing any kind of character who is marginalized, and it doesn't just have to do with racism or sexism or whatever. I mean, there are 12 major social oppressions in this country, and I can read for them all because of my expertise. Yeah. And so I can read for poor or working class people. I can read for women. I can read for Black, Indigenous, or any person of color, transgender, or any kind of gender variance. I read for queer people, non-Christian, religious identifications, youths, elders, non-United States born people, including indigenous people who aren't seen as citizens by the United States, which is always fascinating, and disabled people, and disabled in any way, physical, cognitive, emotional, non-fluent English speakers, and fat people. So those are the 12 kind of major social oppressions.
Is
And
it okay to say fat? Because
it is, yeah.
we don't even know what we're supposed to say anymore. And I was a little bit shocked when you said fat.
Yeah.
Persecuted, they're not fat, they're wide, or they're
Yeah.
whatever.
A person of size too is what some people say, person of size.
Fat is okay.
Fat people by and large prefer to be called fat because there's nothing wrong with being fat, and so
they claim the word.
Exactly, we remove the stigma from the word. Exactly. There's nothing wrong with being fat. That's just, people's bodies are different, and that's
you fat though? I don't think you're fat.
I'm not fat, but I can read for it because I just have that sense of I don't know, insight, I guess. And I've seen it even in, different screenwriting groups and stuff that I'm in. And it can be so small and subtle, but it really betrays how the writer thinks about a certain group of people. And so, and that's why I think I am uniquely positioned to read, to be a sensitivity reader, because not only do I kind of embody different marginalized identities, but I can read for the major oppressed identities. And because of my studies, and because of my experience teaching in the classroom, and just my knowledge of policy in the United States. I mean, it was illegal to be a disabled person in public up until even the 1970s in some places. Illegal. And that's where the term handicapped came from, was because
I'm confused. What is meant by handicap that you're not allowed to be in public? What is defined that?
Yes. And so they're basically anti-ugly laws, basically. What? Yeah, this is true. This is real. And if you look this up, you will see it. And it was enforced. And so people who were seen as ugly, and this is disabled people, so people who've been disfigured in any way, born with disabilities, whatever it is, it was illegal to be in public, and they couldn't get jobs, they couldn't get housing, and they still can't in many ways. I mean, I would argue that disabled people and children are the most oppressed people in the world. But that's where the term handicapped came from, was they couldn't get a job, so they'd take off their hat and beg on the street for money with their cap in their hand.
And that's why we're not supposed to say that word anymore.
Yes, exactly.
There's a derogatory history behind that. I see now.
100%.
It's not just terminology. There's meaning to this.
Exactly. And I think that's the point. And what a lot of people don't understand too is the history and the policy behind it. And many disabled people now prefer to be called disabled, whereas non-disabled people are like, oh, no, you should say person with a disability. And, disabled people are all, wide range of how they refer to themselves. But by and large, if they have kind of unlearned their own ableism, or are committed to unlearning their ableism, they prefer disabled because it's a huge part of their identity and how they're seen. And so again, there's nothing wrong with being disabled. So why would we try to make it seem like a bad thing, right? It's not a bad thing. If we live long enough, we probably will be disabled. Everyone is temporarily abled, really. I mean, we will all be disabled at some point in our lives, temporary or not. And so
it's called aging.
Exactly. 100%. If we're lucky.
That's another problem too, the ageism here. I have to pause here to rant my bit on aging.
Yes.
I'm offended by organizations, and I'm not going to name them, where they have fellowships and programs for women over 40. I find that to be so offensive. Since when do you set a marker for when women are ugly or disabled or unable or unattractive? That is just so offensive to me, because if our lifespan is, and a healthy lifespan lives to 100 almost, 50 years old is when your life is just beginning. Right. So why are you putting us on Social Security, on ARP or whatever, Why are you cutting off our lifeline and mentally telling us to grow old at 50% mark of when our life is just beginning our maturity into real adulthood and spirituality? I just want to have my rant on that,
I
because
love
people
it.
need to stop having these fellowships with 40 years old and over. It's like, that's so
40
offensive
is
to me.
young. Yeah, 40.
It's
I
so
mean, I'm
offensive
40.
to me.
Yeah. And I can see where it comes from, because we work in an industry that's very obsessed with youth. And so it kind of gives younger people the benefit or more of the opportunities to gain success, right? And so if they make a program for people who don't actually have access to it in the way that young people do, I can see that it's like they're trying to do it, but at the same time, it also plays into this idea that 40 is old. And it's not. I mean, I'm 40, like, as I just turned 40 a few months ago, and I feel young, you know, but I've lived enough life to like have some wisdom, right?
Right.
But we live in a society that is anti-aging. And instead of creating products that are anti-aging, we should just be pro-aging, you know, and like be okay with that.
I
Because,
totally agree.
you know,
Mm.
it's very and as someone who's aging, and I can see that I'm aging, and you know, I see, you know, when I was younger how people would react to me versus now, you know, and I love it. Of course, I'm like, I'll be a crone, I don't care. You know, I don't want this.
It's so dispiriting, if that's the word. I don't know if I invented that word, but it's so disheartening, dispiriting, because I mean, that is just like calling someone ugly. You may as well call people at a certain age ugly if you're going to call that old, because you're not old.
No,
And even if you were old, it shouldn't be such a derogatory statement. But anyway,
absolutely. Yeah.
sorry to cut you off there.
No worries at all. um yeah, so yeah, that's what sensitivity reading is. It's just someone who can read for bias. And if you're someone who wants to do right by people, and you're writing a diverse cast of characters, you want a sensitivity reader, because we all have biases. We all grew up in this world, right? And if you grew up in the United States, we were socialized to be anti-Black. There's no way of getting out of that, right? It's the air we breathe. And so if, you know, as writers, we want to be empathetic, we want to be understanding, and show nuance and truth about people without being one-dimensional. And that's what a sensitivity reader can help with, and say, you know what, you have this criminal and they're Black. Why did you make that choice? You know, and when you ask questions like this, people are like, oh, well, I don't know. Actually, I don't really know why I did that. That's how I thought of it. And it's like, well, we're socialized to believe in Black criminality, so that anytime we hear about a crime, our mind automatically assumes it's a Black person. That's how we've been socialized to believe.
Except for people who cut up bodies and put them in a box. That's always a white person.
Right? How is that? I mean, exactly. Like, serial killers are notoriously, and also mass shooters, right, are 99.9% white and male, you know, even more male.
And yet they're idealized, iconicized in media,
Yes.
in true crime shows,
Yes.
in copycats and all of that. Very strange that they're idealized.
They are.
Most heinous crimes ever.
Yep. Exactly. And they become famous. I mean, like, Jeffrey Dahmer had huge fan clubs of women writing letters to him and sending him their underwear and all this stuff. And it's like, why?
And,
you know?
And the sad part is that there's actually movies being made about it that further glamorizes this. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. I mean, you're really triggering me with all this.
I know, I'm so sorry. This is why sensitivity.
I mean, trigger not in the bad way. It's just like I can't keep my ranting from like coming out.
Yes, it's sparking thought.
Yes.
That's the ideal.
Yeah. How did the need for sensitivity reading come about? When, how? Just a little bit of context, you know.
I think, you know, as more and more stories are being told from perspectives that aren't cis, white, hetero men, we are seeing the biases kind of play out. And you can see this in films from 20 years ago. You can see this in TV shows from 5 years ago. It's very blatant, and you can see it. I feel like 2020 hindsight, like it's easier to see as a little bit of time has passed. But as more stories are being told about different kinds of people, we want to make sure that we're telling the stories in truthful and nuanced ways. It doesn't mean that anyone's perfect, right? Nobody's perfect. And that's not what we're trying to do, like sanitize somebody's personality or their actions or something. But it seems that, you know, media and film especially has only given like these complicated, nuanced characters the benefit of the doubt if they're white. And if they're not, then they're these one-dimensional, you know, just characters who you're like, why? Well, what's their story then? Like, if they're a murderer, why? How did they become a murderer? What happened to them that's the case, right? But those weren't the questions being asked. And so I think people started seeing like, wait a minute, if we're going to start being more represented in media, we want it to be a more of a truthful story and more, like I keep saying, nuance, just because it's complicated and more real in that way, if that makes sense. You know, just the complicated nature of human beings. And like James Baldwin says, history is in us. It is in our bodies. And so if we take that and apply it to our writing, then we make very specific choices in our about our characters. And there's a reason for everything. And sometimes the reason is just, oh, well, I just wanted them to be a certain race because that's how I thought of them. Well, why did you think of them that way? And then we can kind of tease out a little bit, like with Mexican Americans too, you know, they were heavily criminalized in this country, especially at the beginning of the 20th century. And you know, and continuing to be so today. I mean, even with the border and people trying to gain asylum, I mean, there's just so many things we can talk about.
Yeah.
But the need came about, I think, because people started saying, hey, you're telling my story, but that's not it. And
Yeah.
that's so offensive to me that you think that way. Like as an Arab, right? Arabs are portrayed as terrorists, you know, and even in the Hurt Locker or in all of these like films that like are Oscar-winning films, and then you see the Arab character and they're one-dimensional evil terrorists, right? Well, what was US policy in the Middle East in the 1970s and the 1960s? What created people to hate the United States so much? Let's look at that history. And there's a history there. And I think that for me, especially, I can bring that, the knowledge of that history to the conversation. And so most sensitivity readers, I will say, they read for their identities. And so if it's, you know, if you're writing a Black female character, you would want to find a Black woman sensitivity reader. Totally cool. Why I feel like I kind of have a little bit of an advantage is because I know this history really, really well. And it's all linked to policy. It's all comes from US policy. So it's not even just cultural in the sense of like, you know,
it's written into law.
Into law.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And into the institutions.
Yeah, it's written into law. I mean, not to digress, but it's written into law of why we emasculate Asian men. It was written into law that they were not allowed to what's the word, intermarry or marry. Yeah, I mean, and that's where the emasculation, it was written into law, and it is for so many races.
Yes, absolutely. Oh no,
we don't know about that isn't in the history books. We don't sit in school and learn about what is written into law that has formed our value systems.
Exactly. And you can find, I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, there's so many national policies, anti-Asian, anti-Chinese policies from even the late 1800s, you know, as more and more people were immigrating to this country. And the you know, white men landowners who were wealthy and had the kind of power that they've had for the past 400 years or whatever, started seeing people having social mobility and financial growth, and they didn't want that. They needed to squash that. So they would create these different laws. It all comes back to
financial property ownership.
Yes.
Love it. People as property and slaves.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm just curious though. I love that this movement came about, but how did it come about? Did it come through colleges? Did it come through academia? Did it come through some group? How did we finally emerge to the point where it's in conversation? You know,
Um, sensitivity reading specifically, or
sensitivity
yeah.
reading, because I didn't really hear about it really until, the past 10 years or so.
Yeah, I don't think there was an academic push for it. I think it really was people, especially marginalized people in the industry, saying, you're not telling this story right.
Oh,
That's not okay that you're telling it that way. Let me help you tell it better, you know? And so then people are like, oh, okay, well, now we're going to have you as a consultant on our show to tell us about the Black experience or the queer experience or whatever. And of course, again, not one person can speak for any community. And that's not what sensitivity readers are trying to do. We're just trying to say, hey, this feels like you hate drug addicts. Is that true? And then the person's like, oh, no, it's just, I was just trying to be funny. Well, why is it funny that we are disparaging these people who really are victims, right? And so just having conversations and people are like, oh, because we write from what we know. And so when we have biases, they're going to come out, and that's okay. They should come out. And that's why you hire a sensitivity reader to talk through those things with you, and to make sure that you don't get canceled, right?
yeah.
Like, I think that's the point. Not only is that the point is to tell, truthful, humanistic stories, but also people are very smart. And if they're watching a show or a movie and they see something that's so offensive, there will be protests about it, and you will lose money on that,
Well, whether there's protests or not, there's a bottom line at stake. And I think, thank God for the internet, which in turn created streaming video and all of that, that it opened up the people who are creating content to a more diverse group of people. Whereas before you only had a box with prime time and everyone could be white and say whatever they wanted to fucking say. And you
Yeah.
just had to sit there and eat it. Thank
Yep.
God. So I think it's people's recognition of the diverse audiences out there. Thank God for the internet and technology.
Yes.
But
100%.
again, it's the bottom line that they're interested in, not so much the diversity, but at least the diversity affects the bottom line.
It does. It is right now. It does seem to
And
be
it's
that way.
dictating that sensitivity reading be done,
Yes,
because the
exactly.
audiences are so diverse in how they watching media from, you know, computers and
Yeah, on your phone, absolutely. Quick reels, and you can feel when someone is, it's that feel. It's why we create art in the first place, right? Is to move people. And so then you have that beautiful story of this, marginalized person, and you have that same identity or a similar one. You're like, holy shit, like, I'm being seen. How amazing is this finally? There's a show called Rummy on Hulu. And that's when I started thinking about screenwriting, actually, because I was like, damn, here's this Muslim dude, this American Muslim dude, like, just kind of fucking up, and like, that's awesome. Like, I want to write myself into this, and so it inspires
that
people.
show inspired you to write.
It did. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. To do screenwriting. I've been writing, since I was a teen, but to do screenwriting specifically. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask a question that's on a lot of people's minds who are new to sensitivity reading, which a lot of creative people who are new to this, they see it as a form of censorship, or they're afraid of being censored, like they can't express themselves. And can you speak to that and to clarify the difference between a sensitivity pass-through and censorship?
Yeah. So, ultimately people can say whatever the hell they want to say, and if freedom of speech does not mean freedom to be without consequence for what you said. It just means you can say whatever the hell you want to say. So if you want to be someone who just is saying shit to piss people off or whatever, go for it. People will get mad, they'll boycott, whatever it is, but you brought that on yourself, right? So sensitivity reading is not about censorship. It's about having a conversation about the bias that is located within your character, in the setting that you've set up, in whatever it is. And so, and asking, like, did you want to make it seem like, you know, you hate Black people? Because it really feels like you hate Black people in what you're saying here. And I know you must not. So let's talk about this, right? And then people will be like, no, it was a joke. That people say that a lot. It was a joke, right? Well, what's so funny about this? What's funny about this? And then people can't really put their finger on it. So I think that it's not about censorship. It's about telling truthful narratives and being complicated about how we do that in a way that moves people and pulls people forward and makes you empathetic and understanding towards people. Whereas censorship is like, nope, stop, we're going to cut you off. That's it, you're done. And that's not the conversation that we're having. The conversation
It's not about censoring and canceling, because that's the interpretation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if anything, it's anti-canceling. Like, if you don't want to be canceled, get a sensitivity reader, because they will help you make sure that you won't be. You know, if you're writing a diverse cast of characters, which you should be, you know, that's the world that we live in. Like, too often, and still to this day, it's all white cast, or maybe one token, you know, character of color. And that's ridiculous. We're in 2023, and there's so many amazing, brilliant minds out there who are just waiting for their chance to tell their story.
Right.
And so, you know, we as people of color and as marginalized people, we're always forced to hear the dominant narrative. I mean, we know the dominant narrative. That's what we see all the time. But the dominant class of people, are like white dominant people. They're not forced to understand the marginalized experience. And so the more and more media gets out there that explores that in all of the different ways that it can be explored, the more they're going to understand too. And hopefully the more, you know, humanitarian and empathetic they'll become.
Yeah.
Because that's the goal, is to create that empathy and understanding of real human characters.
Right. So you would prefer it be called humanity reading. And what I'm hearing from you is actually it's actually compassionate reading.
I like that too. Yeah.
Compassion.
Yeah. I like that a lot.
Yeah. What kind of stuff will you be covering in your webinars on sensitive reading? I mean, I don't want to go just roughly what do you have, like a thing that you go through? Like, what can people expect from a sensitivity reading webinar?
Yeah, 100%. So like the marginalized identities I spoke about at the beginning of our conversation here, I'll be going through all of those and giving examples of a character that you might write who has this identity, right? And instead of, you know, too often in media, we see the sullen, suicidal queer kid, right? And not that that's not true. It is true, but that's
very
because
true.
Unfortunately, right? But society has created that person, right? And so let's tell also the queer joy stories, the gender euphoria stories, and not just the dysphoria stories. Because if we keep telling these stories of like misery, people are only going to think that queer people are miserable, when that's not true, right? Like, there's a reason that we're gay, you know, we're happy, like, it's great. And so just kind of flipping narratives on their heads a little bit, and complicating it.
Right. And also, if you're going to show a gay person being miserable, we need context for that. We need to understand what's causing that, and not just because they're a trope, right?
Exactly. And this one-dimensional character, like, we need to know their story and why they're like that. And there's a reason. There's always a reason. And everyone has humanity, you know, and so let's find the humanity.
So you're basically going to cover all the blind spots that people have with
exactly
stuff shown in media.
Yep, exactly. The 12 major social oppressions that I talked about at the beginning, where I started with poor people and ended with fat people, all of those identities. Yeah, I'll be going through all of those and how to write them in, well, and of course there's a billion different ways to write them, as many as there are folks on this planet, you know. It's just, how do you do it in a way that's respectful to their identity? And even if they're a villain, you know, like, that's okay. You know, there are queer villains, nothing wrong with that. But why? What happened to make them that way? Let's tell that story, you know. And so, like you said, like, the context is key.
Right. Is the pedophile queer just because that's what you think of queer people, queer men, or is he queer because he's struggling with that and he ended up being a pedophile? You know,
I wouldn't put pedophile in the queer umbrella. To me, that's
because I hear that I saw that trope a lot growing
oh
up.
yeah.
Every time it was on the news, pedophile molesting boys, people think, oh, pedophile queer. So you never saw that association? Because I saw.
Oh no, I saw it. It's just, it's not true. The majority of pedophiles are actually straight men. They're
Exactly.
straight.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
So if
the
you look at
impression we have with that trope
exactly.
is pedophile and queer. So if you're gonna make him
Exactly.
pedophile and queer, you're gonna have to explain, is he queer for a reason, or is it because you're following that trope?
Yeah.
If you're gonna create that character, that's what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And, you know, and pedophiles are human too, you know, and so there's a reason that they're the way they are. And that's a different story we could tell. But
Yeah.
those two identities to me are not, I mean, because of my knowledge, are not linked. But we've created, we grew up in a society that has linked them. And even still today, I mean, with the trans panic that's going on, it's grooming and all of this, right? It's trans people grooming young people and all of this. And it's like, okay, well, you know, we are just trying to live our lives and be who we are and love our children. That's really what it comes down to, and like, accept who they are. If anybody's grooming them, it's you trying to indoctrinate them into a religion that hates people, even though your primary disciple spoke of only love for people and of the most downtrodden people. So how can you reconcile that? You know, I find the people who are most grooming are those religious. I mean, and every day we have stories coming out about these Christian pastors who have molested all of these children and had sex crimes against children, all of this stuff. And it's like, to me, it really feels like projection of like, they're doing it, but they can't own that they're doing it. So they're projecting it out onto this marginalized group who are victims of society.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It is, yeah.
And that's a whole other discussion, which I don't want to depress
many ways.
everybody getting into pedophile priests.
I know.
I think you already answered this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What are the possible risks a writer might face if they don't use a sensitivity reader? I know the answer, but I'm going to throw it out there again.
Yeah, you might get canceled, you know, by people, and by the people whose you know, viewership you might want the most, by whose support you might want the most. And so, you know, I don't personally believe in cancel culture. I think that it's a way to be like to evade accountability. And so the critiques against it are all like, no, we shouldn't cancel people because blah, blah, blah. And I get that that can happen. But in a broad sense, I think that these people who feared getting canceled, like, let's say Louis C.K., right, the comedian, he just had a huge show at like Madison Square Garden or something like that. So like, was he really canceled? You know, I mean, these people, they continue to get chances again and again and again. So if you're on the fence and you're like, well, you know, I don't want to get canceled, but I also want to tell my racist joke because I think it's really funny. Well, think about the people that that's going to harm and whose support you will lose by doing that, unless you have a sincere, accountable apology and like make amends and act right.
And not just checking off boxes.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But, you know, I think that like J.K. Rowling right now, right, that there's a lot of discourse going on around her and lots of transphobia happening in the UK and in the United States, of course, all these legislative laws being passed in all these states. But it's part of the conversation. And so do you want to be J.K. Rowling and like double down on your transphobia and then alienate this huge population of people who loved you? You know, I mean, it's heartbreaking for these young queer people or even millennial queer people now who are like, I loved your books and you're such an asshole. You know, like, I'm not going to read your books anymore. I'm not going to watch your movies anymore. And I don't believe you're a good person anymore because you're doubling down on this. And so, you know what? I'm going to make my own fantasy series and I'm going to write my own stuff. And it's going to get a lot of clicks, you know? And I think that if you want to remain relevant as an artist, you have to have an open mind. You just have to. And it's hard. It's hard to do because the young people, they come up with all kinds of stuff all the time. And it's amazing and fascinating and sometimes very hard to keep up with. But that's what life is, you know? And so the more we can kind of work this muscle of being open-minded and being like, oh, it's different now. Okay, let's do it, you know, and just going with it rather than doubling down.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from what you're saying about you know, writers and artists and comedians, you know, dealing with cancel culture or fear of being canceled or not caring about being canceled. It's not so much the cancellation isn't the conversation. Really, the conversation is accountability.
Yeah.
Will you be a responsible human being or, you know, accountability, right? And compassion again. Do you
exactly.
or do you want to say, I don't believe what your beliefs are and be at least accountable, or to say, I don't believe what your beliefs are and I don't give a shit.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And that's what people are responding to.
Yeah.
That you don't give a shit.
Yep.
About your readers, about your audience.
And it hurts. It really does hurt. It hurts people and they internalize it. And then you have, you know, suicidal queer youth and trans youth and, you know, it's heartbreaking and it shouldn't be that way. Exactly. So will you be a responsible, compassionate human being? And isn't that what we all want to be? Right? Is there anyone who's like, no, I don't want to do that? But the way they act.
And I think it hurts because people who read these stories, they internalize it as part of them.
Exactly. Especially children, because that's how children think. That's how they are.
So you're their role model, the characters, their role models, and that's where it's coming from. Yep. Or when people, even adults, when they really admire a book, they admire the author too. And they don't want to know that the author is a complete asshole.
Right.
They don't care about their love for the work.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And we hope that the author or the creator or whatever has the humanity to take that accountability.
Yeah.
And say,
even if in hindsight the things published at least say, oh, I fucked up.
Yeah.
Rather than doubling down.
Exactly.
Right. And not say I fucked up just because there's money at the end of it or you're checking a box.
Yep. That's right. Because you want to be a good person who is a good storyteller and who's a loving, compassionate person. And you want to be remembered as that, right? Like anyone who has relationships with people, you have to learn how to communicate well. You have to learn how to take accountability and apologize easily, you know, and it's hard to do. And so it's just about, being a loving person in the world. Why wouldn't you want to be that?
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. So tell me, how or where can people follow you or get in touch with you for your services or your future talks and stuff like that?
Absolutely. I have a website called readforhumanity.com. You can find me there. I'm also on Instagram as Dena Times.
How do you spell that?
DENATIMES. And it's not, you know, I need to kind of fashion that page into more of my working page, but it's just, you know,
so they can DM you there.
Absolutely, 100%. But yeah, definitely go to my website. There's a contact form on there if you want to reach out and request a service. And yeah, I'll be doing this for a long time. I hope so. Well, I hope that not too long. You know,
you want it all to end, so people don't need you, right?
Exactly. I don't want to be relevant anymore, but I think I am now. But maybe in 20 years I won't be, and that would be fantastic. And then I'll just be writing, you know.
Sounds cool.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Of course. Thank you, G.